The scream that tore through the evening air in Prescott, Arizona, was unlike anything Frank Holloway had heard in his 26 years, and he had heard plenty during his time as a ranch hand in the Arizona Territory. It was June of 1878, and the sun had just dipped below the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Frank had been leading his horse toward the stable behind the boarding house where he had been staying for the past 3 weeks when that sound split the twilight like a knife through canvas. Without thinking, his boots hit the dusty ground at a run, his heart already hammering against his ribs as another cry followed the first, this one more desperate and filled with such raw terror that his blood went cold. The sound came from the small clapboard house at the edge of town. The one everyone knew belonged to Raymond Ackerman, a bitter man who worked occasionally at the lumber mill when he was sober enough to stand upright. Frank had seen the man around town, had noticed the way people gave him a wide berth, the way conversations died when he approached. But Frank had never given much thought to why until this moment, until he heard a woman's voice begging through the thin walls, pleading for mercy that clearly was not coming. He did not hesitate. His shoulder connected with the door with enough force to splinter the frame, and the cheap lock gave way instantly. The scene that met his eyes made his stomach turn and his fists clench automatically at his sides. A young woman, probably no more than 22 or 23 years old, was crumpled against the far wall of the small kitchen, her arms raised to protect her face. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and even in the dim light of the single oil lamp, Frank could see the angry red marks already forming on her pale skin. Standing over her was Raymond Ackerman, his face twisted with rage, a leather belt still clutched in his raised hand. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Frank's voice came out low and dangerous, and he took a step forward into the house. The room smelled of burnt stew and fear and something else, something rancid that might have been whiskey. Raymond spun around, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Get out of my house! This is none of your concern, Cowboy. What happens between a man and his wife is his own business." "Your wife?" Frank's eyes flicked to the woman, who was staring at him with wide hazel eyes that held both hope and terror in equal measure. She had auburn hair that had come loose from its pins, falling in disarray around a face that would have been beautiful if not for the bruises and the split lip. "That gives you no right to beat her like an animal." "I said get out!" Raymond lurched forward, the belt still in his hand, but Frank was faster. Years of working with horses and cattle had made him quick and strong, and he sidestepped easily, catching Raymond's wrist and twisting until the belt fell to the floor with a dull thud. "You will not touch her again," Frank said, his voice steady despite the fury coursing through his veins. "Not tonight, not ever." Raymond tried to wrench his arm free, but Frank held firm. The older man was weakened by drink and years of dissolute living, and after a moment of struggle, his shoulders sagged. "She burned the supper," he mumbled, as if that explained everything, as if that justified the horror Frank had walked into. "Worthless woman cannot even cook a simple meal without ruining it." Frank felt disgust rise in his throat like bile. He released Raymond's wrist with a shove that sent the man stumbling backward. "Get out! This is my house. Not anymore. Get out before I forget I am trying to be a decent man and throw you out myself." Frank's voice had taken on an edge that brooked no argument, and something in his eyes must have convinced Raymond that he meant every word. The older man cast one last venomous look at the woman huddled against the wall, then stumbled toward the door, muttering curses under his breath. Frank watched until Raymond disappeared into the darkness, then turned his attention to the woman. She had not moved, was still pressed against the wall as if trying to make herself as small as possible. Her whole body was trembling, and when Frank took a careful step toward her, she flinched. "I am not going to hurt you," he said softly, crouching down so he was not looming over her. "My name is Frank Holloway. I heard you screaming and I could not just walk by." She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her trying to decide whether to trust him. Finally, she nodded, just barely. "Hannah," she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Hannah Ackerman." "Can you stand?" Frank asked gently, and when she nodded again, he offered his hand. She hesitated before placing her small, work-roughened hand in his, and he helped her to her feet. She swayed slightly, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "You are hurt. Let me take a look." "I'm fine," she said automatically, but even as she spoke, He could see the way she was holding her ribs, the way each breath seemed to cause her pain. Her left eye was beginning to swell, and there were finger-shaped bruises on her upper arms. "You are not fine," Frank said, trying to keep his anger out of his voice, not wanting her to think it was directed at her. "Please, let me help you." Hannah looked at him again, really looked at him this time, and something in her expression shifted. She nodded slowly, and Frank guided her to the single chair at the small kitchen table. The burned pot of stew still sat on the stove, and he moved it aside before pumping some water into a basin. He found a clean cloth hanging by the window and dampened it, then turned back to Hannah. "This might sting," he warned before gently pressing the cloth to the cut on her lip. She winced but did not pull away, and he worked as carefully as he could, cleaning the blood from her face. Up close, he could see that the bruises were not all fresh. There were faded yellow marks on her jaw, old injuries that spoke of a pattern, of a nightmare that had been going on far longer than just tonight. "How long?" he asked quietly, and he did not need to elaborate. Hannah understood exactly what he was asking. 2 years, she whispered, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. "We have been married for 2 years. It started about 6 months after the wedding. He drinks, and when he drinks he gets angry. And when he gets angry." She did not finish the sentence, but she did not need to. Frank felt his jaw tighten, felt the anger surge again, but he pushed it down. Anger would not help her now. "You cannot stay here," he said firmly. "When he comes back, and he will come back, it will be worse." "I have nowhere else to go," Hannah said, and there was such defeat in her voice that it broke Frank's heart. "My parents are dead. I have no siblings. Raymond is all I have." "No," Frank said firmly, setting the cloth aside and looking her directly in the eyes. "That is not true. You have yourself, and that is enough. And you have me, at least for tonight. I will not leave you here alone." Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back stubbornly. "You do not even know me. Why would you help me?" Frank thought about that for a moment, about all the reasons he could give. Because it was the right thing to do, because no one deserved to be treated the way she had been treated, because he had been raised by a mother who taught him that a real man protected those who could not protect themselves. But what he said was simply, "Because I heard you scream, and I could not walk away." Something in those words seemed to reach her, and a single tear escaped, trailing down her cheek. Frank gently wiped it away with his thumb, and for a moment they just looked at each other in the dim lamplight. Then Hannah took a shaky breath and squared her shoulders, and Frank saw a strength in her that had been hidden beneath the fear. "What do I do?" she asked. "First, you pack whatever you need. Then I am taking you to the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson, who runs it, is a good woman, and she will give you a room for tonight. Tomorrow we will figure out the rest." "I have no money," Hannah said, shame coloring her voice. "That does not matter right now. What matters is getting you somewhere safe." Frank stood and offered his hand again, and this time Hannah took it without hesitation. He helped her into the small bedroom off the kitchen and waited by the door while she gathered a few belongings into a worn carpet bag. He noticed how little she had, how threadbare the dresses hanging in the wardrobe were. Raymond Ackerman had not just been cruel, he had been stingy as well. When Hannah emerged with her bag, Frank took it from her and led her out of the house. The night air was cooler now, and Hannah shivered in her thin dress. Without a word, Frank shrugged out of his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, but she pulled it close gratefully, and they walked through the quiet streets of Prescott toward the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson answered Frank's knock with a lamp in her hand and a curious expression on her weathered face. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, and she took one look at Hannah's battered face before ushering them both inside. "Good Lord," she breathed, setting the lamp on the hall table and taking Hannah's hands in hers. "What happened to you, child?" "Her husband," Frank said simply, and Mrs. Patterson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Raymond Ackerman," she said, and it was not a question. "I have heard rumors, but I never knew for certain. Come, dear, let us get you settled. I have a room on the second floor that is empty." Frank followed them up the narrow stairs, carrying Hannah's bag. Mrs. Patterson unlocked a door to reveal a small but clean room with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the main street. It was sparse, but it was safe, and that was all that mattered. "You stay here as long as you need," Mrs. Patterson said firmly, turning to Hannah. "And do not worry about payment right now. We will sort that out later." "Thank you," Hannah whispered, and fresh tears were threatening again. Mrs. Patterson patted her hand, then turned to Frank. "You did a good thing tonight, Mr. Holloway. Not many men would have gotten involved." "I did what anyone should have done," Frank replied, but he felt uncomfortable with the praise. He set Hannah's bag on the floor by the bed and turned to leave, but Hannah's voice stopped him. "Frank," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "Thank you. I do not know how to repay you." "You do not need to repay me," he said gently. "Just promise me you will stay here tonight and not go back to that house." "I promise," she said, and he believed her. Frank left the boarding house and walked back through the dark streets, his mind churning. He knew this was not over, knew that Raymond would not simply accept what had happened. The man had a mean streak and a sense of entitlement, and he would not take kindly to being embarrassed or losing control over his wife. Frank would need to be careful, would need to watch his back. But more than that, he needed to figure out how to help Hannah truly escape the trap her life had become. He did not sleep much that night, lying in his own room at the boarding house and listening to every sound, half expecting Raymond to show up drunk and angry. But the night passed quietly, and when dawn broke over Prescott, painting the desert landscape in shades of pink and gold, Frank rose and dressed, his mind already on what needed to be done. He found Hannah in the dining room, sitting alone at a table by the window. She looked fragile in the morning light, the bruises on her face more vivid now, her left eye nearly swollen shut. She was wearing the same dress from the night before, and Frank made a mental note to see about getting her some proper clothes. "Good morning," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and despite everything, she managed a small smile. "Good morning," she replied. "I was hoping I would see you. I wanted to thank you again." "You do not need to keep thanking me," Frank said, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," she admitted, "but better than last night. Mrs. Patterson brought me some salve for the bruises, and she's been very kind." Frank nodded, relieved that Hannah was in good hands. Mrs. Patterson appeared a moment later with plates of eggs and biscuits, setting them down in front of Frank and Hannah with a motherly efficiency. "You both need to eat," she said firmly. "Especially you, dear. You are too thin by half." Hannah ducked her head, embarrassed, but she picked up her fork and began to eat. Frank noticed she ate slowly, as if she was not accustomed to having enough food, and his anger at Raymond Ackerman flared again. They ate in companionable silence for a while, and then Frank cleared his throat. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about what you should do next. You cannot stay married to a man like that, Hannah. You deserve better." "I know," she said quietly, setting down her fork. "But divorce is not easy, especially for a woman. And even if I could get one, what would I do? I have no money, no skills beyond keeping house. Who would hire me?" "We will figure it out," Frank said with more confidence than he felt. "There are always options. Maybe you could find work here at the boarding house or at one of the shops in town, or maybe you could start fresh somewhere else, somewhere Raymond cannot find you." Hannah looked at him with those hazel eyes, and Frank saw hope beginning to kindle there, fragile but real. "You really think I could do that?" "I know you can," he said firmly. "You are stronger than you think. Hannah, you survived 2 years with that man. You can survive anything." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face despite the bruises, and Frank felt something shift in his chest, something warm and unexpected. He pushed the feeling aside, telling himself he was just glad to see her looking more hopeful. The rest of the morning passed quickly. Frank had work to do at the ranch where he'd been employed for the past few months, and he reluctantly took his leave of Hannah, making her promise to stay at the boarding house and not venture out alone. She agreed, and he headed out to the ranch with his mind still half in the events of the previous night. The ranch belonged to a man named Thomas Wilder, a fair employer who ran cattle across several thousand acres of scrubland north of Prescott. Frank spent the day mending fences and moving stock, hard physical work that normally would have occupied his full attention. But today, his thoughts kept drifting back to Hannah, to the way she had looked crumpled against that wall, to the way she had smiled at breakfast. When evening came and Frank returned to town, he found himself heading straight to the boarding house. He told himself he just wanted to make sure Hannah was all right, that Raymond had not tried to bother her. But if he was honest with himself, he would have admitted that he simply wanted to see her again. He found her in the parlor, sitting in a chair by the fireplace with some mending in her lap. Mrs. Patterson was there too, knitting in another chair, and they both looked up when Frank entered. "Mr. Holloway," Mrs. Patterson greeted him warmly. "Just in time for supper. Go wash up and join us." Frank did as he was told, and soon he was seated at the dining table with Hannah, Mrs. Patterson, and the two other boarders who lived in the house, an elderly man named Mr. Simmons and a schoolteacher named Miss Clara Burke. The conversation flowed easily, though Frank noticed the others were careful not to ask Hannah too many questions. It was clear Mrs. Patterson had explained the situation, at least in general terms. After supper, Mrs. Patterson shooed everyone out of the dining room so she could clean up, and Frank found himself alone with Hannah in the parlor again. She settled back into her chair with the mending, and Frank took the seat across from her. "You do not have to work," he said gently, nodding at the pile of clothes she was repairing. "Not tonight." "I want to," Hannah said, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric. "Mrs. Patterson has been so kind, and I feel I should do something to earn my keep. Besides, it keeps my hands busy." Frank understood that, understood the need to stay occupied, to keep dark thoughts at bay. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the ticking of the mantel clock. "Can I ask you something?" Hannah said suddenly, looking up from her work. "Of course. Why did you come to Prescott? What brought you here?" Frank leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "Work, mostly. I've been moving around the territory for the past few years, taking ranch work where I can find it. My parents had a small farm in Texas, but they both passed a few years back, and I did not have the heart to stay there alone, so I sold it and started drifting." "Do you like it?" "The drifting?" "I do not know," Frank said honestly. "It is lonely sometimes, but it is also freeing, not being tied to one place. I can go wherever I want, do whatever I want." "That must be nice," Hannah said wistfully. "I have never been anywhere but Prescott. I was born here, grew up here, married here. I have never seen the ocean or the mountains or any of the big cities back east." "Maybe someday you will," Frank said. "Maybe," Hannah agreed, but she did not sound convinced. They talked late into the evening, and Frank learned more about Hannah's life. She told him about growing up as an only child, about losing her parents to fever when she was 19, about meeting Raymond at a church social and thinking he was charming and attentive. She had been young and alone and desperate for security, and Raymond had seemed like the answer to her prayers. She had not seen his true nature until after the wedding, and by then it had been too late. "I should have left sooner," she said quietly, her hands still on her mending. "I should have found a way." "You are leaving now," Frank said. "That is what matters." "Am I, though?" Hannah looked at him, her eyes troubled. "Leaving, I mean. I'm still his wife. He could come here and demand I go home with him, and legally I would have to obey." "The law is not always right," Frank said firmly, "and I will not let him take you back to that house. You cannot watch over me forever, Frank. You have your own life, your own work." "Maybe," Frank said, "but I can watch over you for now, and we will figure out the rest as we go." Hannah studied him for a long moment, and Frank had the feeling she was trying to understand something, to puzzle out why a stranger would go to such lengths for her. He was not entirely sure he understood it himself. All he knew was that when he looked at Hannah, he saw someone worth protecting, worth helping. And more than that, he saw someone he wanted to know better, someone who intrigued him in a way no one had in a long time. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Frank would rise early and head out to the ranch for work, and Hannah would spend her days at the boarding house, helping Mrs. Patterson with cooking and cleaning and laundry. She insisted on earning her keep, and Mrs. Patterson was happy to have the help, so it worked out well for both of them. In the evenings, Frank would return, and they would have supper together, often sitting in the parlor afterward and talking until the fire burned low. Frank learned that Hannah had a quick wit and a good sense of humor, qualities that had been buried under years of fear and abuse, but were beginning to emerge now that she felt safe. She told him stories about growing up in Prescott, about the characters who had populated the town in her childhood, and Frank found himself laughing more than he had in months. Hannah, for her part, began to look less haunted. The bruises on her face slowly faded from purple to yellow to green, and finally disappeared altogether. She put on a little weight, and there was color in her cheeks again. She smiled more easily, laughed more freely, and Frank could see the woman she might have been if life had been kinder to her. Raymond did not show his face at the boarding house, but that did not mean he had given up. Frank heard reports around town that the man was drinking heavily and making threats, saying that no cowboy was going to steal his wife and get away with it. Frank stayed alert, always aware of his surroundings, and he made sure Hannah did not go anywhere alone. About 2 weeks after the night Frank had broken down the door, he came back from the ranch to find Hannah waiting for him in the parlor, her face alight with excitement. "Mrs. Patterson told me about something," she said as soon as he walked in. "There's a dressmaker in town, Mrs. Hollister, who is looking for an assistant, someone to help with sewing and fitting and such. Mrs. Patterson thinks I should apply for the position." "That is wonderful," Frank said, genuinely pleased. "Are you going to do it?" "I think I want to," Hannah said, but there was hesitation in her voice. "But I am nervous. What if Mrs. Hollister will not hire me because I am married to Raymond? What if people think I am a bad woman for leaving my husband?" Frank sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Anyone who thinks that is a fool," he said firmly. "You left a man who was hurting you. That makes you brave, not bad. And if Mrs. Hollister is any kind of decent person, she will see that." Hannah looked at him, and Frank saw trust in her eyes, trust that he would tell her the truth. "Will you come with me tomorrow, when I go to talk to her?" "Of course," Frank said without hesitation. "I will come with you." The next day, Frank took time off from the ranch and accompanied Hannah to the dressmaker's shop on Main Street. It was a small but tidy establishment with a large window displaying the latest fashions, or at least the latest fashions that had made their way to Prescott. Mrs. Hollister turned out to be a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and clever hands, and she looked Hannah up and down appraisingly when they entered. "You are Hannah Ackerman," she said, and it was a statement, not a question. "Yes, madam," Hannah said, and Frank could hear the nervousness in her voice. "I have heard some things about you recently," Mrs. Hollister continued, and Frank tensed, ready to defend Hannah if necessary. But then the dressmaker smiled, and it was warm and genuine. "I heard you left that no-good husband of yours after he laid hands on you. Good for you. A man who would strike a woman is no man at all." Hannah blinked in surprise, and Frank relaxed slightly. "Thank you, madam," Hannah said. "I came because Mrs. Patterson said you might be looking for someone to help in your shop." "That I am," Mrs. Hollister said. "Can you sew?" "Yes, madam. My mother taught me when I was young, and I have been doing all the mending for Mrs. Patterson's boarding house." "Show me," Mrs. Hollister said, handing Hannah a scrap of fabric and a needle and thread. Hannah sat down and began to work, her stitches small and even and precise. Mrs. Hollister watched critically, then nodded. "You have good hands. The position pays $3 a week, and you would work 6 days, 9 in the morning until 5 in the evening. Does that suit you?" "Yes, madam," Hannah said, her face lighting up. "That suits me very well." "Then you can start on Monday," Mrs. Hollister said, offering her hand. Hannah shook it, her smile so bright it could have lit the whole shop. When they left the dressmaker's, Hannah was practically bouncing with excitement. "I have a job," she kept saying, as if she could not quite believe it. "I have a real job." "You do," Frank said, grinning at her enthusiasm, "and you are going to be wonderful at it." On impulse, Hannah threw her arms around Frank's neck, hugging him tightly. He stiffened in surprise for a moment, then relaxed and hugged her back, acutely aware of how small and warm she felt in his arms. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I did not mean to be so forward." "You have nothing to apologize for," Frank said, and he meant it. "I'm happy for you, Hannah. You deserve this." They walked back to the boarding house, and Frank found himself noticing little things about Hannah that he had not paid attention to before. The way the afternoon sun brought out the red highlights in her hair, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the way she moved with a grace that was all the more remarkable considering what she had endured. He was falling for her, he realized with a start. Somewhere between breaking down that door and now, he had started to care about Hannah Ackerman as more than just someone who needed help. He cared about her laugh, her dreams, the way she was slowly coming back to life like a flower that had been too long in the shade. It should have scared him, should have made him want to pull back. He had spent years avoiding attachments, avoiding the risk of losing someone the way he had lost his parents. But with Hannah, he found he did not want to run. He wanted to stay, wanted to see where this could lead. But he could not tell her that, he knew. Not yet. She was still healing, still figuring out who she was outside of the prison her marriage had been. The last thing she needed was another man complicating her life. So Frank kept his feelings to himself and focused on being her friend, the one person she could count on no matter what. Hannah started work at Mrs. Hollister's shop the following Monday, and she thrived there. She had a natural talent for sewing and an eye for detail that Mrs. Hollister appreciated. More than that, she had a gentle way with customers that made them feel at ease. Within a few weeks, Hannah had become an indispensable part of the shop, and Mrs. Hollister told Frank privately that she did not know how she had managed without her. As summer deepened and the days grew longer and hotter, Frank and Hannah continued to spend their evenings together. Sometimes they would sit in the parlor and talk, and sometimes they would walk through the streets of Prescott as the sun set, enjoying the cooler air. People in town had started to notice them together, and Frank knew there was gossip. But he did not care, and Hannah said she did not either. "Let them talk," she said one evening as they walked past a group of women who stopped their conversation to stare. "I have spent too much of my life worrying about what other people think. I am done with that." "Good," Frank said, and he meant it. One evening in late July, Frank returned to the boarding house to find Hannah waiting for him on the front porch, an envelope in her hands. Her face was pale, and Frank knew immediately that something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, taking the steps two at a time. "It is from a lawyer," Hannah said, her voice shaking slightly. "Raymond is filing for divorce. He is citing abandonment and claiming I am an unfit wife." Frank took the letter and scanned it quickly. The legal language was dense and formal, but the gist was clear. Raymond wanted to end the marriage, but he was painting Hannah as the villain in the situation. There was no mention of his abuse, no acknowledgement of why Hannah had left in the first place. "Can he do that?" Hannah asked. "Can he make it seem like this is all my fault?" "He can try," Frank said grimly. "But anyone who knows the truth will see through it. And you know what? Let him have his divorce. That is what you wanted anyway, is it not? To be free of him?" "Yes," Hannah said slowly. "But I thought I would have to fight for it, that I would have to prove what he did to me. I did not expect him to just give up." "Maybe he realized he lost," Frank said. "Or maybe he is just angry enough to want to hurt you in whatever way he can. Either way, if he wants a divorce, I say we let him have one. And then you will truly be free." Hannah looked at the letter again, then at Frank. "Will you come with me to talk to the lawyer? I do not understand all of this legal language, and I am afraid I will say something wrong." "Of course," Frank said immediately. "We will go tomorrow." The next day, they visited the office of the lawyer whose name was on the letterhead, a man named Samuel Pierce, who had a practice on the second floor of one of the buildings on Main Street. Pierce was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a brisk, businesslike manner. He listened as Hannah explained what had happened, and Frank was gratified to see that Pierce seemed sympathetic. "Mr. Ackerman came to see me last week," Pierce said when Hannah had finished. "He was quite intoxicated and quite insistent that I help him divorce you as quickly as possible. He said some things that were, frankly, not fit to repeat in mixed company, but the gist of it was that he blames you for embarrassing him in front of the town and wants to be rid of you." "Will it be difficult?" Hannah asked. "The divorce, I mean." "Not particularly," Pierce said. "Arizona territory law allows for divorce on grounds of abandonment, which is what Mr. Ackerman is claiming. However, I should point out that you would have grounds for divorce as well, on the basis of cruelty and abuse. If you wanted to countersue, we could certainly do that." Hannah was quiet for a moment, and Frank could see her thinking. Then she shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "I just want it to be over. If he wants to claim I abandoned him, let him. I do not care what people think, and I do not want to drag this out any longer than necessary. I just want to be free." Pierce nodded approvingly. "Very well. I will draw up the papers, and we should be able to have this finalized within a few months. In the meantime, I would advise you to stay away from Mr. Ackerman and avoid any situations where he could claim you are harassing him or causing trouble." "That will not be a problem," Hannah said quietly. They left the lawyer's office, and Frank could see that Hannah was processing everything. They walked in silence for a while, and then Hannah stopped and turned to face him. "In a few months I will not be married anymore," she said, and there was wonder in her voice. "I will be truly free." I can do whatever I want, go wherever I want. I will not belong to anyone." "You never belonged to him," Frank said firmly. "You are your own person, Hannah. You always have been." She smiled at that, a slow, sweet smile that made Frank's heart skip a beat. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. I do not know what I would have done without you these past weeks." "You would have managed," Frank said. "You are stronger than you think." "Maybe," Hannah said, "but I am glad I did not have to find out." The weeks that followed were good ones. Hannah continued to work at the dressmaker's shop, and Frank continued his work at the ranch. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, spending their evenings together and slowly growing closer. Frank noticed the way Hannah's hand would sometimes brush against his when they walked, the way her eyes would linger on him when she thought he was not looking. And he knew she must notice the way he looked at her, the way he always found excuses to be near her. But still, neither of them spoke of it. There was an unspoken agreement that they would wait until the divorce was final, until Hannah was truly free. It was like they were holding their breath, waiting for something to begin. In early September, the divorce papers came through. Hannah was officially no longer Hannah Ackerman. She went back to her maiden name, Hannah Ashford, and Frank thought it suited her better. The name Ackerman had never fit right, had always seemed like a chain around her neck. But Ashford was hers, was part of who she had been before Raymond had tried to break her. The night after the papers were finalized, Frank took Hannah to dinner at the nicest restaurant in Prescott. It was a small establishment called the Silver Spur, and it was where the ranchers and business owners went when they wanted to impress someone. Frank could not really afford it on his ranch hand wages, but he did not care. This was important. They sat at a table by the window, and Hannah looked beautiful in a new dress she had made herself, a soft blue that brought out the color of her eyes. She was nervous, Frank could tell, twisting her napkin in her lap. But she was also happy, genuinely happy in a way he had rarely seen. "I feel like I should make a toast," Hannah said when the waiter brought their food. "But I do not know what to say." "To new beginnings," Frank suggested, raising his water glass. "And to the future, whatever it may hold." "To new beginnings," Hannah echoed, clinking her glass against his. They drank, and then Hannah set down her glass and looked at Frank seriously. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I've been thinking about it for weeks, and I have decided I need to say it, even if it changes things between us." Frank felt his heart start to pound. "All right. I'm in love with you," Hannah said simply. "I think I have been for a while now, maybe since that first night when you broke down the door and saved me. I know it is probably too soon, and I know I have no right to expect anything from you after all you have done for me already. But I needed you to know. I needed to be honest." Frank stared at her, stunned. He had hoped, had even dared to dream, but hearing the words out loud was different. It made it real, made his own feelings impossible to deny. "Hannah," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I am in love with you too. I've been trying not to be, trying to give you space and time, but every day I fall a little more, and I do not think I can stop it. I do not want to stop it." Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears, and she was smiling. "Really?" "Really," Frank said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I love you, Hannah Ashford. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you laugh. I love the way you have fought to rebuild your life. I love everything about you." "I love you too," Hannah whispered, squeezing his hand. "So what do we do now?" "Now," Frank said, "we figure out our future. Together." They talked long into the night, sitting at that table in the Silver Spur, until the staff started giving them pointed looks. They talked about what they wanted, about their hopes and dreams. Hannah said she wanted to keep working at the dress shop, that she loved having her own money and her own purpose. Frank said he wanted to keep working at the ranch for now, but someday he hoped to have a small spread of his own, nothing fancy but enough to make a living. "We could do that together," Hannah said shyly. "If you wanted, I could help. I'm good with animals, and I learn quickly." "I would like that," Frank said. "I would like that very much." When they finally left the restaurant and walked back to the boarding house, Frank walked Hannah up to her room. They stood in the hallway, neither wanting the evening to end. "Can I kiss you?" Frank asked softly, and Hannah nodded, her eyes bright. Frank cupped her face gently in his hands, mindful of the bruises that had only recently faded, and bent to kiss her. It was soft and sweet and perfect, and when they broke apart, Hannah was smiling. "I have been wanting you to do that for weeks," she admitted, and Frank laughed. "I have been wanting to do it for weeks," he said, "but I wanted to wait until you were ready." "I am ready," Hannah said. "I am ready for all of it, for you, for us, for whatever comes next." "Then we will face it together," Frank promised. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Frank's life. He and Hannah courted properly, though everyone in Prescott already knew they were in love. They went on picnics out in the desert, rode horses through the scrubland, and spent hours just talking and being together. Frank introduced Hannah to Mr. Wilder at the ranch, and the rancher took a liking to her immediately, joking that Frank was lucky to have found such a good woman. In December, as the weather turned cooler and the holidays approached, Frank decided it was time. He bought a simple gold band from the jeweler in town, spending most of his savings on it but not caring. On Christmas Eve, he asked Hannah to take a walk with him, and they wandered through the quiet streets of Prescott until they reached the edge of town, where they could see the stars spreading out above them like diamonds on velvet. "Hannah," Frank said, taking her hands in his, "I know we have not been together that long, at least not in the traditional sense, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" He pulled out the ring, and even in the dim starlight, it glinted beautifully. Hannah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, of course I will marry you." Frank slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, not caring who might see. Hannah kissed him back with all the passion and joy that she had kept locked away for so long, and Frank felt like the luckiest man in the world. They were married in February of 1879, in a small ceremony at the church in Prescott. Mrs. Patterson stood up as Hannah's witness, and Mr. Wilder stood up for Frank. Mrs. Hollister closed the dress shop for the day so she could attend, and even the lawyer, Mr. Pierce, showed up to wish them well. It was a far cry from Hannah's first wedding, which had been a somber affair attended by only a handful of people. This time, Hannah glowed with happiness, and Frank could not stop smiling. After the ceremony, there was a small celebration at the boarding house, and then Frank and Hannah left for a few days at a small cabin that Mr. Wilder had offered them for a wedding trip. It was in the mountains outside of Prescott, and it was simple but beautiful, with a view that stretched for miles. Those first days of their marriage were perfect. They were alone together for the first time, truly alone, and they learned each other in all the ways that mattered. Frank was gentle and patient, knowing that Hannah's experiences with intimacy had not been kind ones, and Hannah was grateful for his care. But as the days passed, Hannah grew more confident, more willing to explore this new side of their relationship, and Frank was more than happy to meet her there, to show her what love could really be like. When they returned to Prescott, they moved into a small house on the edge of town that they rented from Mr. Wilder. It was not much, but it was theirs, and Hannah set about making it a home with the same determination she had applied to everything else. She sewed curtains for the windows and quilts for the bed, and Frank built her a garden box where she could grow vegetables. They were not rich, but they were happy, and that was worth more than all the money in the world. Spring turned to summer, and summer to fall. Frank continued working at the ranch, and Hannah continued working at the dress shop. They saved every penny they could, dreaming of the day when they could afford a small place of their own, with a few head of cattle and maybe some chickens. It was a simple dream, but it was theirs. In October, Hannah came home from the dress shop one day with a secret smile on her face. Frank noticed immediately, the way he noticed everything about her. "What is it?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. "You look like the cat that caught the canary." "I have news," Hannah said, her eyes sparkling. "I went to see the doctor today because I have been feeling strange lately. Frank, I'm going to have a baby." For a moment, Frank could not speak. He just stared at her, trying to process the words. Then a grin spread across his face, so wide it almost hurt. "A baby?" he repeated. "We are going to have a baby?" "Yes," Hannah said, laughing at his expression. "In the spring, probably April or May. Are you happy?" "Happy?" Frank picked her up and spun her around, not caring that they were standing in the middle of their small kitchen. "Hannah, I am more than happy. I am ecstatic. We are going to be parents." He set her down gently, suddenly worried that he might hurt her or the baby. Hannah laughed at his concern, but allowed him to fuss over her, making her sit down while he fixed supper. From that day on, Frank was attentive to the point of being almost comical, always worried that Hannah was doing too much or lifting something too heavy. Hannah bore it with good humor, knowing it came from love. As Hannah's pregnancy progressed, Frank became even more determined to give his family a better life. He talked to Mr. Wilder about buying a small piece of land, and the rancher, who had become something of a mentor to Frank, offered to sell him 40 acres at a price Frank could actually afford. It was scrubland mostly, but there was water and good grass, and it was enough to start with. Frank worked extra hours, taking on any job he could find, and Hannah continued at the dress shop until she was too far along to work comfortably. Mrs. Hollister promised to hold her position until after the baby came, and Hannah was grateful for the security. In late April of 1880, on a warm spring evening, Hannah went into labor. Frank was out at the new property, working on building a small cabin, when Mrs. Patterson's son came riding out to get him. Frank made it back to town in record time, his heart in his throat, and found Dr. Morrison already at the house with Hannah. The next hours were the longest of Frank's life. He paced the small parlor, listening to the sounds from the bedroom and feeling utterly helpless. Mrs. Patterson brought him coffee and told him everything was fine, but Frank could not relax until he heard the sound he had been waiting for, the thin, wavering cry of a newborn baby. Dr. Morrison emerged a few minutes later, smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. Holloway. You have a son." A son. Frank felt tears prick his eyes, and he did not try to hide them. "And Hannah. She's tired but well. You can go in and see them now." Frank entered the bedroom to find Hannah propped up against the pillows, looking exhausted but radiant. And in her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was the smallest person Frank had ever seen. He had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face, and Frank thought he was the most beautiful thing in the world. "Come meet your son," Hannah said softly, and Frank crossed to the bed, sitting carefully on the edge. Hannah placed the baby in his arms, and Frank held him with trembling hands, terrified he might drop this precious bundle. "He is perfect," Frank whispered. "You are perfect. Hannah, I do not know what I did to deserve this, to deserve you and him." "You saved me," Hannah said simply. "You gave me a life worth living, and now we have created a new life together." "What should we name him?" Frank asked, unable to take his eyes off his son's tiny face. "I was thinking James," Hannah said. "James Thomas Holloway, after your father and Mr. Wilder." Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. His father had been named James, and he had been a good man, the kind of father Frank hoped to be. And Mr. Wilder had become like family to them, a mentor and friend. "James Thomas Holloway," Frank repeated. I like that a lot." Little James was a good baby, healthy and strong. Frank and Hannah settled into the rhythms of new parenthood, the sleepless nights and the tiny joys. Frank continued to work on the cabin at their new property, and by midsummer it was finished enough that they could move in. It was small, just 2 rooms for now, but it was solid and well built, and it was on land that belonged to them. Hannah went back to work at the dress shop part-time, and Mrs. Patterson was happy to watch James when Hannah was working. The baby was the darling of the boarding house, and even crusty old Mr. Simmons could be found cooing at him in the parlor. As James grew from a baby into a toddler, Frank and Hannah's property grew too. They added a few head of cattle, then a few more. Frank built a barn and a proper chicken coop, and Hannah's garden flourished. It was hard work, backbreaking at times, but it was theirs, and they were building something together. In the spring of 1882, Hannah found out she was pregnant again. This time, it was a girl, born in November with her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes. They named her Emma Grace, and James, who was 2.5 by then, was fascinated by his baby sister. The years rolled on, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. The ranch grew slowly but steadily, and Frank's reputation as an honest and hard-working man grew with it. Hannah continued to work at the dress shop when she could, and she also started taking in sewing work at home. Between the ranch, the sewing, and Frank's occasional work for Mr. Wilder, they made enough to be comfortable, though they were never rich. In 1885, Hannah had another baby, a boy they named William. And in 1888, when Hannah was 32 and Frank was 36, they had their last child, a girl they named Sarah. 4 children, a ranch, a home they had built with their own hands. It was more than either of them had ever dreamed of when Frank had broken down that door in 1878. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were in bed, Frank and Hannah would sit on the porch of their cabin and look out over the land. They would talk about the old days, about how far they had come, about how different their lives might have been if Frank had not heard Hannah's screams that night. "Do you ever regret it?" Hannah asked one evening, her head resting on Frank's shoulder. "Stopping to help me, I mean. Your life would have been simpler if you had just walked on by." "Not for 1 second," Frank said firmly, wrapping his arm around her. "You and the children are the best thing that ever happened to me. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "I love you," Hannah said, tilting her face up to kiss him. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "And I love you," Frank replied, "always and forever." As the years went on, their children grew. James turned out to have his father's aptitude for ranching and his mother's determination. By the time he was 18, he was running much of the ranch operation himself, allowing Frank to slow down a bit. Emma was quieter, more bookish, and she eventually became a teacher in Prescott. William was the adventurous one, always getting into mischief but with a heart of gold, and Sarah was the baby, spoiled by her older siblings but sweet-natured and kind. In 1895, when Frank was 43 and Hannah was 41, they received word that Raymond Ackerman had died. He had fallen from his horse while drunk, they were told, and had broken his neck. Frank and Hannah received the news with a strange mixture of emotions. There was no joy in his death, but there was a sense of closure, a final severing of the last tie to that dark chapter of Hannah's life. "I do not feel anything," Hannah said when they got the news. "Is that wrong? Should I feel something?" "You feel what you feel," Frank said. "He was a part of your life once, but he does not define you. You define yourself, Hannah. You have always been so much more than what he tried to make you." "I am who I am because of you," Hannah said, "because you showed me what real love looks like." "No," Frank corrected gently. "You are who you are because you had the strength to keep going, to rebuild your life. I just helped a little." "You did more than help a little," Hannah said, but she was smiling. The turn of the century came and went, and the Holloway family continued to thrive. James married a local girl named Catherine in 1901, and they gave Frank and Hannah their first grandchild, a boy named Frank Jr., in 1902. Frank held his grandson and felt the circle of life continuing, felt the legacy he and Hannah had built together extending into the future. Emma married a fellow teacher in 1903, and they moved to Phoenix, where he had taken a position at a larger school. William, ever the adventurer, joined the cavalry and spent several years traveling before finally settling down with a rancher's daughter in 1906. And Sarah, the baby of the family, married a doctor in 1908 and stayed in Prescott, close to her parents. As Frank and Hannah grew older, they spent more and more time simply enjoying each other's company. The ranch was in good hands with James, and they could afford to take things easier. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset over the land they had worked so hard to build, and they would hold hands like young lovers. "Do you remember that first night?" Hannah asked one evening in the summer of 1910. They were both in their 50s now, their hair streaked with gray, their faces lined with the years. But when Frank looked at Hannah, he still saw the beautiful young woman he had fallen in love with. "Every detail," Frank said. "I remember thinking I had never heard a sound like that scream, and I remember the way my heart was pounding when I broke down that door. And I remember seeing you there, so scared but so brave, and thinking that I could not let anything else happen to you." "You saved my life," Hannah said quietly. "Not just that night, but every day since. You showed me what it means to be loved, really loved. You gave me a family and a home and a reason to believe in happiness again." "You saved me too," Frank said. "I was drifting before I met you, just moving from place to place with no real purpose. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something that mattered. You gave me everything, Hannah." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out, one by one, painting the sky with light. And Frank thought about all the years they had shared, all the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and the struggles. It had not always been easy, but it had always been worth it. In 1912, Frank and Hannah celebrated their 33rd wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a big party, and there was food and music and laughter. Frank looked around at his family, at the life he and Hannah had built together, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," he said to Hannah as they danced together in the yard, moving slowly to the music. "For everything. For loving me, for building this life with me, for giving me more than I ever dreamed possible." "Thank you," Hannah replied, her eyes shining with tears, "for hearing me that night, for breaking down that door, for being the man I needed you to be." They danced until the stars were bright overhead, surrounded by their family, blessed beyond measure. And though they could not know it then, they would have many more years together, many more sunsets and many more quiet evenings on the porch. They would see their grandchildren grow and have children of their own. They would see the world change around them, new inventions and new ways of living. But through it all, they would have each other, and that would be enough. Years later, when Frank was an old man of 78 and Hannah was 76, they sat on that same porch, watching the sunset over the land that had been theirs for so long. James was running the ranch now with his own sons, and Frank and Hannah had finally retired for good. Their bodies were slower, their steps more careful, but their love was as strong as it had ever been. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Hannah asked, her hand in Frank's. "What is that?" "I think about what might have happened if you had not heard me that night. If you had been just a few minutes later, or if you had decided it was not your business, my whole life would have been different. I might not have survived." "But I did hear you," Frank said firmly, "and I will always be grateful that I did. That night changed both of our lives, but it changed them for the better." "For the better," Hannah agreed. "I got 57 years with you, Frank Holloway. 57 years of love and laughter and family. I got to watch our children grow and our grandchildren be born. I got to wake up every morning next to a man who loves me and treats me with kindness and respect. I got everything I ever wanted and more." "So did I," Frank said, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "So did I." They sat there as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. And as the first stars appeared, Frank pulled Hannah closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They had started with a scream in the darkness and a door broken down. But they had built a lifetime of love from that violent beginning, had transformed pain into joy and fear into hope. And that, Frank thought as he held his wife close, was the greatest gift of all. Not just that they had found each other, but that they had chosen each other day after day, year after year. They had built something beautiful and lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. The stars came out one by one, filling the sky with light. And Frank and Hannah sat together on their porch, two souls who had found each other against all odds, and they were content. They had lived, they had loved, and they had built a legacy that would endure. And when they finally passed, many years later, within months of each other, as longtime couples so often do, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to remember them. They told stories of Frank's kindness and Hannah's strength, of the love that had sustained them through decades of joy and sorrow. They spoke of the ranch they had built and the family they had raised, and they remembered that it had all started on a summer evening in 1878, when a cowboy heard a woman's scream and made the choice to break down a door. That choice had changed everything. It had saved a life, created a family, and built a love story that would be told and retold for generations. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the pain that had brought them together, but the love that had kept them together through all the years and all the challenges until the very end. Their story was one of redemption and hope, of second chances and new beginnings. It was proof that even in the darkest moments, there can be light. Even in the deepest pain, there can be healing. And even when all seems lost, there can be love, strong and true and enduring. Frank and Hannah Holloway lived their lives with grace and dignity, building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. And when their great-grandchildren asked about them, when they wanted to know the story of how their family began, they were told about a summer evening in Prescott, Arizona, about a scream in the darkness, and about a man who made the choice to act. They were told about love that conquered fear, about strength born from adversity, and about two people who found each other and held on tight, no matter what the world threw at them. They were told about a cowboy and a woman who had been beaten for burning the evening meal, and how their story became one of the greatest love stories the family had ever known. And that story, passed down through the generations, served as a reminder that love can be found in the most unexpected places, that heroes come in many forms, and that sometimes all it takes to change a life is the willingness to break down a door when you hear someone crying out for help. The Holloway Ranch still stands today, worked by descendants of Frank and Hannah, a testament to what two people can build when they have love and determination and each other. And on quiet evenings, when the sun sets over the Arizona landscape, painting the sky in brilliant colors, the family still gathers on that porch, telling stories and making memories, carrying on the legacy that Frank and Hannah began all those years ago. It is a legacy of love, of family, of resilience in the face of hardship. It is a reminder that our choices matter, that our actions have consequences that ripple out far beyond what we can see. And it is proof that sometimes the greatest adventures, the deepest loves, and the most meaningful lives begin with a single moment of courage, a single choice to act when action is needed. Frank heard a scream, and he broke down a door. And in doing so, he saved not just a life, but created a future full of love and hope and possibility. That is the story of Frank and Hannah Holloway, a love story born in violence, but nurtured into something beautiful, something lasting, something that proved that love, real love, can overcome anything.